Welcome to accommodate this, and welcome to the third video in a short series covering the history of disability benefits in the United States. In the previous two videos, we covered the history leading to the establishment of the NIH and Social Security, and the history leading to the establishment of Medicaid and Medicare. While these were significant advancements benefiting marginalized communities in this country, we were still a couple decades from the most significant law benefiting the disabled population. We pick up the story just after the start of the Vietnam War and passage of Medicaid and Medicare. And again, because people in this country are so slow to accept change, in 1966, the Supreme Court finally reversed their earlier ruling in support of poll taxes and declared that poll taxes for any level of elections are unconstitutional. I still can't believe it took 30 years for that. 30 years! In the same year, the government passed an amendment to FICA, expanding payroll taxes to help pay for Medicare. Remember, both Social Security and Medicare are paid for through federal income taxes. They are not entitlements, as many on the far right claim. More about that later. In 1967, the Division of Regional Medical Programs was created to administer grants for research for heart disease, cancer, and strokes. The NIH lobbied for increased federal funding to accommodate this. At that time, there were many concerns that the definition of disability may have eroded over time, resulting in too many allowances. Opponents claimed too many allowances could result in further increased costs in the future. By redefining disability, they could emphasize the importance of medical factors as part of the determination process, adding, "Only if his physical and mental impairment or impairments are of such severity that he is not only unable to do his previous work, but cannot, considering his age, education, and work experience, engage in any other kind of substantial gainful work which exists in the national economy, regardless of whether a specific job vacancy exists for him or whether he would be hired if he applied for work." Essentially, the definition of disability included a requirement for establishing disability by medical means, but no longer emphasized rehabilitation even if the disabled person had the skills to work and jobs were available for them to apply for. This change ultimately expanded eligibility for disabled people. However, to offset that decision, they added restrictions for dependents who are also disabled. The amendment provided for payments of benefits to disabled widows and widowers age 50 or older, but with the requirement for medical evidence for their disability. At the same time, newly appointed Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, faced the decision to either increase taxes or cut programs to address the $4 million deficit he inherited. Based on statistics that California's mental hospitals for the mentally ill and those with intellectual disabilities had dropped 40% between 1959 and 1967, he announced a plan to eliminate 3,700 staff from the hospital system. That's about 14% of the state's hospital workforce. The reduction in patients was due to the development of new medications and antipsychotic drugs, but Reagan had overlooked the fact that these medications were mostly effective on those with minor impairments, allowing them to leave the system. However, those who remained in the hospital system required intensive care, which already took up most of the staff's time. Thus, the level of care patients received as a result of his cuts was devastating. The following year, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, or FHA, was passed. This act added affirmative action for Native Americans and housing. It expanded housing funding programs concerning sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, and national origin. California's governor also passed the Short-Doyle Act in 1968, which, when combined with the Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act of 1967, created the California Medical Health Act. But instead of shrinking the budget, these acts increased the budget by $28 million, a scandal that stuck with Reagan for decades. This act laid out a system for handling the mentally ill locally, which at the time also included mentally and developmentally disabled, designed to protect patients from institutionalization without consent, remove the stigma of mental illness, ensure confidentiality of records, and promote community-level care. These acts further recommended shifting funds to community health programs when patient numbers dwindled. Although this description frames it as a liberal change, the motivation was purely conservative. At the time, the Conservative Party was the Republicans, and Reagan was contemplating whether to change from the Democratic Party to the Republican because of the evolution of his own political values. However, the Republican Party convinced Reagan to remain part of the Democratic Party until the next election when Richard Nixon would be running. That's when the act of switching parties would have the most political impact to help move the country further to the right. Let's take a step back for a second. We are almost into the 1970s, but I can't leave out some of the atrocities that impact some of the changes in the 70s and beyond. For example, lobotomies were invented in 1935. This destructive procedure resulted in worsening mental conditions, despite its reputation for its calming effects. Electroshock therapy was invented shortly after the lobotomy in 1938. This was also considered one of the most effective treatments for seizures and depression, though we have since developed more humane and precise methods for treatment with the advancement of medicinal remedies. During the first two world wars, Johann or Hans Asperger had been studying children with atypical neurology in Vienna at a facility known to be a beacon of anti-Jewish policy, even before the Nazi takeover. The condition he studied was later renamed Asperger's syndrome and subsequently absorbed into autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, in 2013. Hans referred many children to another clinic in Vienna that was responsible for murdering hundreds of children deemed unworthy of life, according to Catholic eugenics, which were promoted by the Third Reich. Although historians disagree on how much he knew about this, it is known that he was a member of the St. Lucas Guild, a physicians' association that advocated for Catholic eugenics. In short, many heinous technologies were being invented and torturous practices were taking place during the first half of the 20th century that were passed off as treatment for disabled children. And those treatments were not only sanctioned by the Catholic Church, but also by the Nazi regime, who seemed more interested in treating children like lab rats than actually understanding and helping them. By the 1960s and 1970s, roughly 1 out of 5 children with disabilities were excluded from attending public school, including children who were blind, deaf, emotionally disturbed, or what they called mentally retarded. At the time, 3.5 million disabled children would go to what they called school, but they were basically warehoused in segregated facilities and received little or no instruction. More than 1 million children had no access to the public school system at all, with many of them living at a state institution where they received limited or no educational or rehabilitation services, and were subjected to horrendous treatments, including lobotomies and electroshock therapy. And during that time, about 75% of deaf or blind children attended state institutions as well. In 1969, President Richard Nixon initiated discussions in welfare reform to address issues similar to the ones Roosevelt raised during the Great Depression. The existing institutions for the disabled were disjointed, unorganized, lacking standards, and were doing more harm than good. As the nation drew more and more conservative, funding became more scarce. This was a tactic used by Reagan when he was governor of California. Eventually, the notion rose that the Social Security Administration should take over the administration of the aid to the blind, aid to the permanently and totally disabled, and aid to the elderly agencies. The hope was that consolidating these under one umbrella would result in some consistency and humanitarian changes, though it would take a few years to write this up and pass it as an amendment to the Social Security Act. A couple of years go by, and the National Cancer Act of 1971 passed in order to strengthen the National Cancer Institute, or NCI. This act essentially funded the institution so that they could carry out the national effort against cancer more effectively. The following year, the Social Security Amendments of 1972 passed. This set of amendments reduced the waiting period for disability benefits from 6 months down to 5 months, and extended the definition of disabled adult children to those disabled before age 22. This amendment also consolidated those disjointed agencies I'd mentioned earlier, and replaced the state program with the Social Security Income Program for the aged, blind, and disabled. This was funded from general revenues and was intended to supplement the income of needy persons age 65 or older, or who were blind or disabled and who received no or only minimal benefits under the Social Security Insurance Program. Unlike the insurance program, eligibility for SSI payments is based on need, requiring assessment of the person's income and resources. This amendment included a modification for SSI claimants under 18, suspension of payments for refusal to accept rehabilitation services, and provided Medicare and Medicaid protection for Social Security disability recipients. In the same year, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 was passed, and it amended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to address employment discrimination against African Americans and other minorities. It also required employers to make reasonable accommodation for religious practices of employees. Probably the most notable change was that it empowered the EEOC to take action against individuals, employers, and labor unions, which violated the act previously passed in 1964. Also in 1972, roughly 8,500 mental patients, which is more than half of California's mental patients at the time, had been released into various communities without capacity to house them. This left them with few options of either facing homelessness or living in rundown neighborhoods where they received no treatment for their illnesses. Even when hospitals attempted to house and treat these patients, the laws prevented them from committing them beyond 72 hours, or if they were determined to be a threat to themselves or another person, 14 days, or if they have physically assaulted another person, then beyond 90 days. Overall, this was a tremendous strain on California's Medicaid program. In 1973, the U.S. withdrew combat units from the Vietnam War. The influx of disabled soldiers significantly increased, including the need for rehabilitation for those who served for extended periods. And several people sued Social Security because of issues with payment. Therefore, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed in order to completely revamp all pre-existing laws that were collectively referred to as the Vocational Rehab Act. This act extended and revised the authorization of grants to states for vocational rehabilitation services. The act also established affirmative action for disabled individuals, which eventually would become Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act 17 years later. It's important to note that it was also in 1973 when the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, declared that sexual orientation was no longer considered a mental illness. This decision was made after tremendous activism efforts from the LGBTQ community triggered by the Stonewall riots. This was significant because At that time, the mentally ill could be institutionalized against their will, fired from their job, denied a mortgage, and more. Several of those penalties are still in place today. In 1974, the Supplemental Security Income for the Aged, Blind, and Disabled program replaced the Social Security Titles 1, 10, and 14 that were passed in 1935 and 1950, and consolidated them under one title, Title 16. The Vietnam War officially ended the following year in 1975 after claiming 58,220 American lives. The Education for Handicapped Children Act of 1975, or EHA, was passed to alleviate the financial burden created by all the lawsuits that came up before passing the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The EHA also established educational reforms, which required schools to evaluate children with disabilities and create an educational plan with parent input that emulated the educational experiences of non-disabled students as closely as possible. This act was essentially an attempt to desegregate schools to allow disabled children to attend public schools, but it allowed for a loophole known as the Least Restrictive Environment, or LRE. While the overall act was aimed at incorporating disabled students into regular classes, the LRE loophole provided an exception for when instructional goals could not be achieved, because the disabled student was either a distraction to others or were too distracted to learn in such an environment themselves. The act also required school districts to provide administrative procedures for parents of disabled children in the event that they wanted to dispute decisions made by the school. Between 1970 and 1980, the number of insured increased by more than 1/3, and contributions to the Disability Trust Fund almost tripled, due in part to increases in the disability program's tax rate allocation. The number of beneficiaries was almost doubled in 1980 than what it had been in 1970, and outgoing payments increased by a multiple of 5. In 1977, a new benefit formula was introduced that decoupled the cost of living adjustment from wage increases in an effort to control spiraling Social Security program costs. A series of amendments followed. The Social Security Disability Amendments of 1980 focused on removing work disincentives built into the disability program due to a buildup of various pressures that drained the trust fund. And these pressures included reforms that accounted for changes in public attitudes toward disability, including high unemployment rates and administrative factors, as well as initiatives to release mental patients from institutions and return them to local communities for care, as was done in California under Ronald Reagan's governorship. As president, Reagan was able to mainstream his ideas, which were previously ridiculed as amateur and showed a lack of knowledge of the system. But the focus was on reducing government reliance, and local care was seen as more compassionate, and a more conservative stance was favored by the public at the time. Consistent with conservative values, the amendments also provided incentives for rehabilitation and return to work, and a cap on family benefits paid to disabled insured workers and their dependents. Considering the conservative majority's stance was that independence was better than dependence, people believed state assistance was disproportionate to the need. Worse yet, state-specific agreements were completely abolished, essentially standardizing the disability determination requirements and procedures across the country. So the destructive and discriminatory conservative policies from Reagan's amateur California governorship were enacted as the standard across the entire nation. And while state institutions were still relied upon for their services, it granted the national secretary to monitor state agencies for consistency and regulation adherence. The amendments also established a rule for reviewing disability beneficiaries every 3 years unless the disability was considered permanent. Before this amendment, reviews were conducted only in select cases where the individual's condition was expected to improve or if they returned to work. Congress felt this was inadequate, though it was met with public criticism for the effects that it had on some beneficiaries because these periodic reviews often resulted in termination of payments to many long-term beneficiaries who did not expect the review. Unfortunately, just as had happened in California in the 1960s and 70s, these changes resulted in thousands of mental patients being released into the community without support, which contributed to the homeless and welfare crises of the 1980s. In 1981, the Social Security amendments introduced a cap on total payments received from multiple government programs, hoping to strengthen work incentives. This included a 9-month trial work period with an additional 15-month period for testing the individual's ability to work while retaining disability status. Payments are suspended during that time, but reinstated if work attempts fail. The amendment also included earnings demonstrating substantial gainful activity would be reduced by any work expenses related to their impairment. In June of that same year, the AIDS epidemic began, leading to widespread fear and confusion, as well as contributing to more discrimination against the LGBTQ community, who were wrongfully targeted and blamed for the epidemic. Between 1980 and 1982, alcohol, drug abuse, and mental health administration were cut by 30%. On top of that, Medicare and Medicaid, as well as private insurers, had distinct healthcare biases on how funds were distributed, which often were heaviest for healthcare as opposed to mental health care. Studies show this limits outpatient care while increasing the prevalence of socially disruptive behavior because it attempts to treat mental health without properly supporting the effort. More than 24 review hearings were held during 1982 through 1984, raising questions about the selection criteria for disability case reviews, including the quality of adjudications, adequacy of medical evidence, and determination standards. Some beneficiaries were concerned continuing cases were being treated as if they were initial claims, essentially disregarding all previous findings. Some contended a disability has only ended based on medical factors showing evidence of medical improvement. Criteria for establishing disability based on mental impairment were considered too restrictive for younger individuals who were presumed to have the capacity for unskilled work, resulting in almost automatic termination. And in an effort to save money, these unwarranted terminations had a damaging effect on public perception. Besides, many of the beneficiaries who were removed would likely go on general assistance, nullifying any cost savings to the government. So many administrative initiatives were undertaken in 1982 to improve the periodic review process and the quality of disability determinations. By 1983, major reforms were introduced, including a moratorium in the review of most mental impaired cases, pending a thorough review of evaluation standards, substantial increase in the percentage of beneficiaries classified as having a permanent disability, establishing a random review selection process, a top-to-bottom review of evaluation standards, and several of the initiatives suggested in 1982. The 1983 Reform Bill also included an opportunity for beneficiaries to have a face-to-face evidentiary hearing, which was an opportunity to receive conditional benefit payments through an administrative law judge. And the bill established improved standards for medical cessation, a moratorium on periodic reviews of mental impairment cases, statutory standards for evaluating symptoms, and more. Many of these were in response to court orders from class action suits in federal courts. All of this led to the Social Security Disability Benefits Reform Act of 1984, which re-emphasized the congressional intent that there be a national uniformity among the disability programs. This Reform Act established statutory standards for disability evaluations. It also established standards for termination reviews if substantial medical evidence shows improvement to the point that substantial gainful activity is possible. The Reform Act addressed the issue about severity being a factor when there are multiple disabilities. For instance, a person can have multiple non-severe impairments, none of which would qualify them for disability coverage on their own, but together would add up to a significant enough set of impairments. It also dealt with the issue of pain, which was considered too subjective and difficult to establish, by requiring medically verifiable signs of impairment that could reasonably produce pain or other symptoms, rather than relying on the claim of pain alone. The Reform Act also appointed a commission to study the evaluation of pain in a disability determination, acknowledging there was still room for possible improvement in this area. The Reform Act prohibited personal appearance from being a factor in an eligibility determination because some people would dress poorly in hopes of receiving a better evaluation. And finally, it placed a moratorium on periodic reviews of all mental impairments cases pending revised diagnostic criteria. In 1984, roughly 115 years after the discovery of DNA, the U.S. government began planning for the Human Genome Project, or HGP, whose primary goal was to map and sequence the entire human genetic code. This meant identifying all human genes, deciphering all DNA strands, and essentially identifying the code to build human beings. This would eventually lead to greater understanding of genetic conditions, leading to innovative treatments and technologies to benefit the human race. By the next year, 1985, the revised criteria for making mental impairment determinations was completed. In 1986, spending on mental health and substance abuse continued to drop. This added more pressure to an already strained system that struggled to treat the mentally ill, mentally disabled, and developmentally disabled population. This led to more homelessness and poverty across the nation. That brings us to 1987, when NASA announced they had found a hole in the ozone atmosphere, sparking national concerns. This led to many reforms, including the abolishment of CFCs and nationwide awareness efforts. There was also a huge crash of the stock market, driving the United States into a depression. Reagan's policies had already hobbled mental health institutions across the country, but a depression only made matters worse. In an effort to regain public support, President Ronald Reagan urged the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall, which had encircled Berlin for 26 years. That same year, the government also passed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1987, or OBRA, which established a cutoff for entitlement to disability benefits. The old eligibility rules allowed beneficiaries who were attempting to return to work a 15-month review period where they could be working and still retain their disability status in case their attempt failed. This reduced the number of instances requiring review and reapplication. OBRA said the old time frame would apply to beneficiaries found eligible before passing of this act. But for anyone who becomes a beneficiary after this act was passed, would be allowed 36 months. Furthermore, if the disabled person had worked above the substantial gainful activity level, and were therefore no longer entitled to disability benefits, the Act provided an option to buy in to Medicare after the expiration of extended Medicare benefits. This ensured people would not simply lose access to medical care if they were not fully recovered, but were on their way toward recovery. The Civil Rights Act of 1988 prohibited basic discrimination of people with disabilities, families with children, and pregnant women, and made it a federal crime to, by force or by threat of force, injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone by reason of their race, color, religion, or national origin, handicap, or familial status. However, the damage to our system of support for mental health and disabilities had already been done. 1997 and 1998 marked the end of Reagan's presidency, which was called a lame duck presidency by many. In fact, his policies emphasizing a favorable political narrative over the needs of the mentally ill and disabled have had lasting effects on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid even to this day. In 1990, the Human Genome Project officially began, and the DOE and NIH established a 13-year timeline for the project. This was also a time when our understanding of autism was gaining clarity, and the medical industry was moving toward a more standard definition of the condition. The Gulf War, also known as the Desert Shield or Desert Storm, broke out that same year, which is also when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990, or IDEA, was passed. This act replaced the Education for Handicapped Children Act of 1975, or EHA. It placed more focus on the individual rather than the conditions that they have. It promoted research and development of technology, post-high school transition programs, and programs that educated children in their neighborhood schools to help non-disabled children understand disabilities better. And it required public schools to create individualized education programs, known as IEP or special education, or free appropriate public education, FAPE. While these acts demonstrated a huge leap forward in understanding and accepting people with disabilities, none of them compares to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or the ADA, which established more rights for disabled citizens than any previous act. The ADA requires employment affirmative action for individuals with disabilities, including a requirement for employers to provide reasonable accommodations. Accommodations in the workplace are adjustments made in a system to accommodate or make fair the same system for an individual based on a proven need. Accommodations can be religious, physical, mental, or emotional, academic, or employment-related. But the important part is that failure to accommodate was now legally considered a form of discrimination. This act also established requirements to provide equal access to goods and services, which applies to employers, education, housing, courts, and other public venues. Some examples may include facilities, whether publicly or privately owned, that are used by the public at large. For example, inns, hotels, motels, and other establishments that provide lodging to transient guests, retail stores, rental establishments, service establishments, educational institutions, recreational facilities, and service centers. From that point forward, all of these places were required to be accessible to the disabled and may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. Some exceptions did still apply, though. For instance, private clubs and religious organizations were considered exempt under the federal law, though they were encouraged to comply, and some states already had requirements for private clubs. In fact, many states and their subdivisions already had several more strict regulations in place, including prohibiting discrimination based on gender or age. And at the time, more than half of the states allowed discrimination against LGBT people, despite the fact that sexual orientation was no longer considered a disability. However, very few states already prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation and/or gender identity. One last set of exceptions is that this act did not afford any more rights or benefits for people with antisocial conditions, such as kleptomania, pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism, and so on, as these are considered different from disabilities or other mental health conditions. Join me next time as we conclude this 4-part series on the history of disability benefits in the United States. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this, or click on the video here to continue watching.